The gavel echoed in the courtroom, drowning out the anxious whispers. A trial like any other until the defendant walked in. Judge Eleanor Grant held her breath. Her eyes were fixed on the shackled man before her. A familiar face, a past she thought she'd buried long ago. Old memories resurfaced, bringing with them a series of unanswered questions. How could a boy once full of dreams end up on trial today? What led them down such different paths? And most importantly, what would Eleanor do when the truth was not as simple as what was written in the files? Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment with your city or country, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on stories that touch your heart. The story begins. The courtroom buzzed with the usual anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers. Spectators whispered. The sound of a gavel echoed from another room. Judge Eleanor Grant sat on the bench, her gaze steady and professional. Just another day, another case, or so she thought. The court clerk called the case. The state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat. Her hand rested on the polished oak surface of her desk. She glanced at the documents in front of her. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A familiar disappointment washed over her. Another lost soul trapped in the system, she mused. When the defendant was brought in, her world tilted. The man standing before her, hands and feet in shackles, was not a stranger. It was her James Williams. Her throat tightened as a rush of memories flooded back. Summer afternoons they spent racing bikes on the dusty roads of Hammond, Louisiana. Late nights chatting under the magnolia tree in her backyard. The promises they made as children to always support each other no matter what. But the man before her was not the boy she once knew. His shoulders slumped. His face was etched with years of hardship. But those eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. "James?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the years melted away. He was James again, the boy with the mischievous grin and the heart of gold. But the moment was fleeting. The reality of the situation crashed down on them both. He was a defendant and she was the judge. Their paths had diverged long ago, leading them to this impossible moment. The trial began, and Eleanor found herself torn between her duty and her heart. The evidence against James was damning, yet she couldn't reconcile it with the boy she knew. As the days passed, Eleanor delved deeper into James's past, trying to understand how he had ended up here. She spoke to old friends, teachers, and even his estranged family. The picture that emerged was complex, a story of poverty, neglect, and a system that had failed him. Eleanor began to see the case not as black and white, but as a tapestry of gray. She saw the human being behind the defendant, the boy who had been lost along the way. The time came for Eleanor to deliver her verdict. The courtroom was silent, every eye on her. She looked at James, his gaze fixed on the floor. She knew that her decision would not only determine his fate, but also her own. With a deep breath, she began to speak, her voice resonating with the weight of the truth. In this case, the evidence presented paints a clear picture of the defendant's actions. However, it is the duty of this court to not only deliver justice but also to understand the circumstances that led to these actions. Eleanor's words were measured, her tone firm yet compassionate. She acknowledged James's crimes, but she also shed light on the systemic failures that had contributed to his downfall. James Williams is not simply a criminal. He is a product of a society that has failed its most vulnerable. He is a reminder that justice without understanding is blind. The courtroom was stunned. This was not the verdict they expected. Eleanor had not only judged James, but she had also judged the system itself. She sentenced James to a rehabilitation program, a chance to rebuild his life. She believed in him even when he had lost faith in himself. As James was led away, he looked back at Eleanor, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He knew that he had been given a second chance, not just by the court, but by his childhood friend. Eleanor watched him go, a sense of peace settling over her. She had done her duty, But she had also followed her heart. She had recognized her childhood friend, not just as a defendant, but as a human being deserving of compassion and redemption. The story doesn't end here. What do you think will happen to James? Will he be able to turn his life around? And what about Eleanor? Will she face repercussions for her unconventional verdict? Let us know in the comments below. Eleanor's hand hovered over the gavel. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as she tried to process the impossible. James looked up. His expression was a mix of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, his head slightly bowed. The entire courtroom waited. Eleanor forced herself to speak. "Mr. Anderson, you are charged with assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded. She wanted to stop everything, demand answers. What happened to him? How did their paths diverge so drastically? But the role of a judge required composure. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. As the prosecutor began his case, Eleanor's mind wandered. This was not just another case. This was James. And somehow, she had to find a way to separate her past from the present, before it was too late. The courtroom faded as Eleanor's mind drifted back to a time long before she wore the black robe and held the gavel. She and James had grown up on opposite sides of Hammond, Louisiana, separated not by distance but by the unspoken rules of their segregated town. Her family's house was a modest one-story with a white picket fence, while James's family lived in a rundown house at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields. Their friendship was an anomaly. She remembered how they met, a chance encounter at the edge of a creek where she had wandered too far from her backyard. James was fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She offered to help, and that simple gesture turned into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. "Eleanor," he had once said, lying on the grass beside her under the stars, "do you ever think about leaving this place? I mean, really getting out of here, to a place where people don't look at us funny just because we're sitting together?" She had laughed, dismissing the idea, but James was serious. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always have room for people like him. Their bond deepened despite the whispers, the furtive glances, and the open disapproval from both sides. But the pressure was always there, a weight they both carried. One sweltering summer, when they were 14, everything changed. A series of robberies plagued the town, and the suspicion fell heavily on the black community. One evening, James and Eleanor were walking home from the library when a police car pulled up beside them. The officers questioned them harshly, their eyes filled with suspicion. Eleanor, privileged by her skin color, was allowed to go home. James was taken to the station. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She knew James was innocent. The next morning, she went to the police station, determined to tell them the truth. But when she arrived, she was met with a wall of resistance. They wouldn't even let her see James. James was released a few days later, but he was never the same. The spark in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a deep-seated anger. He became withdrawn, distant. The unspoken rules of their town had finally caught up with them, tearing their friendship apart. Eleanor tried to reach out to him, but he pushed her away, his heart wounded and hardened. The incident at the police station was a stark reminder of the divide that separated them, a divide that no amount of shared dreams could bridge. Years passed. Eleanor went on to excel in school, eventually leaving Hammond to attend college and then law school. She carried the memory of James with her, a constant reminder of the injustices that plagued their society. She vowed to make a difference, to use her position to fight for those who didn't have a voice. Now, standing in the courtroom, facing James once again, Eleanor felt the weight of her past colliding with her present. She had to make a choice. Would she uphold the law, or would she follow her heart? The answer, she knew, would determine not only James's fate but also her own. And then, one day, it was over. It was the summer before high school, when Eleanor's father caught them sitting on the porch. His voice was cold, sharp, authoritative. "Eleanor, get inside this house, now." She hesitated, glancing at James, who stood frozen in place. "Go," he said softly, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you later." But they didn't see each other again, not really. Her father forbade her from seeing James, and soon after, his family moved away. Eleanor threw herself into her studies, her ambitions taking her far from Hammond. She studied law, pursuing her dream of justice and equality. But she never forgot the boy who taught her the meaning of courage. Now, sitting on the judge's bench, she wondered what had happened to James after she walked into the house and closed the door on their friendship. His file showed a series of arrests for petty offenses, shoplifting, loitering, nothing that suggested a violent nature. But then again, how much of a person's life can you see in a few lines of a record? The prosecutor's voice pulled her back to the present. He was describing the crime James was accused of: assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk was slightly injured, and the cash register was emptied. James was apprehended a few blocks away, the money allegedly still on him. Eleanor watched James as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slumped, his hands clasped in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. Did he really do it? Or was there more to the story than the prosecution was presenting? The trial adjourned for lunch, giving Eleanor some time to think. When she returned to her chambers, her clerk, Abigail, approached her hesitantly. "Judge Hayes, are you all right? You seem a little distracted," Abigail asked. Eleanor hesitated. Should she confide in Abigail? Would it be unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be when the past she had buried so deep was sitting just a few feet away, waiting for her judgment? The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed. Reporters took notes, the clerk shuffled papers, and the prosecutor, a sharp man named Michael Powell, was ready to present his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Powell began, his voice ringing with authority, "we are here today to seek justice for the victim of a violent crime. A hardworking store clerk who was simply trying to earn a living when he was brutally assaulted and robbed." He went on to describe the events of the robbery, painting James as a dangerous criminal who had shown no remorse for his actions. He presented the evidence: the store clerk's testimony, the security camera footage, and the money found on James. Eleanor listened intently, her mind racing. The evidence was damning, but something didn't add up. She couldn't reconcile the James she knew with the man the prosecutor was portraying. The defense attorney, a young woman named Sarah Jones, presented a different picture. She argued that James had been in a desperate situation, struggling to find work and provide for his family. She portrayed him as a victim of circumstance, a product of a society that had failed him. Eleanor watched James as his attorney spoke. For the first time, she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. He was no longer just a defendant. He was a human being with a story to tell. The trial lasted for several days, each side presenting their case, each witness adding another piece to the puzzle. Eleanor listened, observed, and weighed the evidence. She knew that her decision would have a profound impact on James's life. When the time came for closing arguments, Powell reiterated his claim that James was a dangerous criminal who deserved to be punished. Jones, on the other hand, argued that James was a man who had made a mistake, a man who deserved a second chance. Eleanor listened to both sides, her heart heavy. She knew that whatever decision she made, it would be difficult, and someone would be hurt. Finally, the time came for the jury to deliberate. Eleanor watched as they filed out of the courtroom, their faces serious and thoughtful. She knew that they held James's fate in their hands. She sat on the bench, waiting for the jury to return, her mind filled with memories of James, of their childhood, of the promises they had made to each other. She wondered if he still remembered those promises, if he still believed in the possibility of a better future. After what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned. Eleanor watched as they filed into the courtroom, their faces grave. She knew that the moment of truth had arrived. The foreman stood up and addressed the court. "We, the jury, find the defendant James Anderson, guilty of assault and robbery. Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment, but she also knew that the jury had done their job. They had followed the law, and she had to respect their decision. She looked at James, who stood with his head bowed, his face etched with despair. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that she still believed in him, but she knew that she couldn't. She was the judge and he was the defendant. Their paths had diverged long ago, and there was nothing she could do to change that. She sentenced James to 10 years in prison, the mandatory minimum for his crimes. She watched as he was led away, his eyes filled with hopelessness. She knew that she would never forget him, that he would always be a part of her life. As she left the courtroom, she couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if things had been different, if they had stayed friends, if they had found a way to overcome the obstacles that had separated them. She knew that she would never have the answers to those questions, but she also knew that she would never stop asking them. The story doesn't end here. What do you think will happen to James? Will he be able to turn his life around after serving his time? And what about Eleanor? Will she ever be able to reconcile her past with her present? Let us know in the comments below. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Powell began, his voice firm. This case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, assaulted an innocent clerk before taking the money from the register. The evidence will show that James Williams is guilty of this crime. Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her throat. Her stomach churned. The prosecutor's tone was cold, detached, as if James was just another name on a docket. She glanced at James, his eyes still fixed on the table in front of him. The defense attorney, Sarah Porter, rose to give her opening statement. She was young but confident, her voice resonating through the room. The prosecution wants you to believe that this case is simple, but it's not. My client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the beginning. We will prove that there is more to this story, and that the assumptions made on the night of his arrest do not hold up under scrutiny. The first witness called to the stand was the store clerk who had been working the night of the incident. He described seeing a man matching James's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then jump over the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something about it sounded rehearsed. Sarah's cross-examination was sharp. Mr. Chambers, you said that the man who assaulted the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct? Yes, the witness replied. Did you get a good look at his face? Not really. It was dark and he had his hood up. Sarah nodded, taking a few steps. So you're saying you can't positively identify the person who committed the assault? Well, no. No further questions, Sarah said, cutting him off. Eleanor noticed James shift slightly in his seat. His shoulders straightened as if the exchange had given him a glimmer of hope. The next piece of evidence was a surveillance video from the store. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecution argued that the person in the video was James, but the quality of the footage made it difficult to discern any identifying features. As the video played, Eleanor watched intently. Was this really James? The figure moved quickly, snatching something from the counter before disappearing from the screen. The footage ended abruptly, leaving a troubling gap in the narrative. James's defense rested on an alibi. He claimed that he was walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. However, the friend was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Sarah argued that the lack of a willing witness did not negate James's innocence, but the jury's expressions betrayed their skepticism. As the trial wore on, Eleanor felt the weight of her position pressing down on her. She was supposed to be impartial, a pillar of justice. But how could she be when every moment reminded her of their shared childhood? The boy who was once her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom, and she was the one tasked with determining his fate. When the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered. On the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the gavel. She wanted to talk to James, to ask him directly what happened. But she knew she couldn't. Any contact outside of the courtroom would jeopardize the case and her career. As she watched James being escorted out of the room in shackles, Eleanor's resolve wavered. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to uncover the truth. But for the first time, she wondered if the truth was something it could ever truly grasp. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as the trial reached a pivotal moment. It was the defense's turn to present their case, and Sarah Porter had called her first crucial witness, Officer Thomas Harris, the arresting officer. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. This was where the cracks, if any, might begin to show. Officer Harris, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, took the stand. Sarah approached him with deliberate calm. "Officer Harris," she began, "you were the one who arrested my client, is that correct?" "That's right," he replied, his voice curt. "You stated in your report that you apprehended Mr. Williams walking 2 blocks away from the scene of the robbery. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And what led you to believe that he was a suspect?" He matched the description, a black male, approximately 40 years old, wearing dark clothing. Sarah's eyebrow rose slightly. Dark clothing? But the suspect in the video was described as wearing a red hoodie. "Did you find a red hoodie on Mr. Williams when you searched him?" Harris hesitated. "No, but he could have gotten rid of it." Sarah stepped closer. "Could have gotten rid of it? Did you or any other officers conduct a search of the surrounding area for this alleged hoodie?" Harris's jaw tightened. "No, we didn't have time. He was apprehended quickly." Sarah pressed on. "So to be clear, you arrested my client based on a vague description with no physical evidence linking him to the scene?" The officer's silence spoke volumes. Eleanor's gaze flicked to the jury. Several members exchanged uncertain glances. Sarah wasn't finished. "Officer Harris, do you recall if Mr. Williams said anything at the time of his arrest?" "He protested, said he was innocent." "And did you consider investigating his claim? Or did you simply assume his guilt based on his appearance?" Harris's face flushed. "I followed procedure." "Procedure?" Sarah echoed, her voice laced with skepticism. "No further questions, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed again as Harris stepped down, his credibility visibly shaken. Eleanor's heart pounded. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning, not just for James but for a system that seemed too quick to condemn him. The defense's next move was unexpected. Sarah introduced an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst explained that based on the height and build of the person in the video, there was no way to definitively confirm that it was James. Furthermore, the timestamp on the footage had been altered, raising questions about its reliability. The prosecution tried to dismiss this testimony as speculation, but the jury looked uneasy. A shadow of doubt crept into the room, and Eleanor could feel its weight as the day wore on. James was given the opportunity to testify in his own defense. Sarah had warned him of the risks, but James insisted. The clink of his shackles was a stark reminder of his situation as he approached the stand. His voice, though quiet, carried a raw sincerity. "I've made mistakes in my life," James began, speaking directly to the jury. "I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people. But I didn't do this. I was walking home that night, minding my own business, when the police stopped me. They didn't ask any questions. They just decided I fit the description." His voice caught slightly as he continued. "I've had to fight my whole life, fight to be seen as more than what people assume about me. But this, I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." Eleanor's throat tightened as James sat down. His words hung in the air, a plea not just for justice but for basic human dignity. She glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of emotions. Doubt, sympathy, and uncertainty. This was it. The truth was no longer confined to evidence or testimony. It was a battle of conscience, a struggle against the weight of prejudice and assumptions. Eleanor knew that her role was not just to uphold the law but to interpret it in a way that served true justice. The final day of the trial arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation. Both sides delivered their closing arguments with precision. The prosecutor relied on circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the system's processes. Sarah, however, implored the jury to look beyond the surface, to consider the holes in the case and the humanity of the man on trial. Eleanor listened intently, her face impassive, but her mind raced. Her role was clear. She could not sway the jury, but she would have the final word if their verdict left room for interpretation. The burden of ensuring justice weighed heavily on her shoulders. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom emptied and filled as people stretched their legs or whispered amongst themselves. James sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He hadn't looked at Eleanor since the first day of the trial, and she couldn't blame him. What could she say to make things better? Finally, the clerk announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room fell silent as the clerk rose, a piece of paper trembling in their hand. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant. The silence was excruciating. Not guilty. The room erupted in a mix of gasps, whispers, and even a few cheers. Eleanor banged her gavel, restoring order. James's shoulders slumped as if a weight had been lifted, but his face remained unreadable. He had won his freedom, but it was clear that the victory came at a cost. Eleanor addressed the court, her voice steady. The jury has spoken. Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. This court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor lingered behind, watching James as he signed his release papers. For a moment, she thought he might leave without a word, but then he turned and approached her. The room was almost empty, save for a few clerks tidying up and Abigail gathering her files. James stopped a few feet from the judge's bench, his expression guarded. You didn't owe me anything, he said softly, but I'd like to know, why didn't you say anything? You knew me. Eleanor's throat tightened, the words catching. Because I couldn't. I had to be impartial. If I had said anything, it could have jeopardized the case. James looked at her, his face a mix of hurt and understanding. Impartial, he repeated. That's the thing, Eleanor. The world has never been impartial, not for people like me. She nodded slowly, her gaze falling to the polished wood of her desk. He was right. I wish I had done more that day. I wish I could do more now. James sighed, the tension in his posture easing slightly. We were just kids. We didn't know any better. But he knows now, doesn't he? I know, Eleanor said, her voice firm. And I'm sorry. James gave a slight nod, then turned and walked away. His back was straight as he disappeared through the courtroom doors. Eleanor sat alone in the empty courtroom. The weight of James's words pressed down on her. She had upheld the law, but the trial had revealed a deeper truth. Justice was not just about verdicts and evidence. It was about lives shaped by systems larger than any one person. For Eleanor, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that her position was not just a seat of power but a platform for change. As she left the courthouse that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the steps, Eleanor made a silent vow. She couldn't change the past, but she would do everything in her power to ensure that the future held more than empty promises of equality. It would be difficult, perhaps even impossible, but she owed it to James and to herself to try. This story raises a big question. Is justice truly always fair? If you were in Eleanor's position, what would you do? Do you believe in second chances for those who have lost their way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might just inspire someone. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and family to spread the message of empathy and the possibility of redemption. Thank you for following this story to the end. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more emotional and meaningful stories. Have a wonderful and loving day. Thank you for supporting our channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. These stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the help of AI. If there are any errors, please forgive us with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.